Hi, this is Shirley Cushing Flint,
And Richard Flint.
and we're going to talk to you about our new book, Overhaul, A Social History of the Albuquerque Locomotive Repair Shops.
Okay, we'll go to talk. You can shut off the, yeah.
The railroad and the beginning of modern Albuquerque. A factor of major importance for New Mexico's future was the post-Civil War explosion of railroad expansion westward from the Mississippi River. On May 10, 1869, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific joined at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, completing the nation's first transcontinental railway line. Even before the Golden Spike ceremony, other railroads were pushing slowly westward from the Mississippi and eastward from the Pacific coast. Across the country in the 1870s, the clear profitability of steam-powered trains stimulated an explosion of railroad building in the West. Among such ventures was the Atchison and Topeka Railway, which had been founded in 1860 as a short-haul line. In the early 1870s, with an eye on a route skirting the southern Rocky Mountains, the small company added Santa Fe to its name and slowly lengthened its line westward. After beating a competing line to Raton Pass in 1878, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, AT&SF, raced toward the west coast by way of New Mexico. Its immediate destination would be a location in the Rio Grande Valley where a division point and major repair shop could be established. The Middle Rio Grande offered a major water source about halfway between Atchison, Kansas, and California. The main competitors to be the site of the shops were the two small towns of Albuquerque and Bernalillo. A very high price asked for the right-of-way at Bernalillo tipped the scales in favor of Albuquerque. The official welcome of the AT&SF Railroad to the location for a major steam locomotive repair shop and the surrounding town site took place on April 22, 1880. A special passenger train carrying dignitaries from around the territory pulled into a makeshift Albuquerque station about 2 miles southeast of the little farming community of that name. A little after midday, setting the tone for the festivities was the band of the U.S. 9th Cavalry. Enthusiasm was abundant that day, and there was also an undercurrent of trepidation. But as it turned out, there was no turning back. Albuquerque would be unalterably changed by the presence of the railroad. In one fell swoop, a 19th century industrial city was born and already growing. For many decades, steam locomotives and steam marine engines drove the vast majority of transportation in the United States and around the world. If steam engines didn't run because of a lack of parts or skilled machinists, neither did the nation's trade and commerce. Essential maintenance and repair kept steam locomotives running. By 1881, the red sandstone walls of the first buildings of Albuquerque locomotive repair shops already housed the daily labor of keeping AT&SF's steam engines in repair. Residential and commercial districts surrounding the AT&SF shops were platted out. Lots were being sold. Modest homes were being built before 1880 was out. To the west of the shops grew the Morelos neighborhood, and to the east was the San Jose neighborhood. It wasn't long before both areas were teeming with shop workers and their families. The shop's workforce. In doing research for Overhaul, we paid particular attention to who made up the workforce at the Albuquerque locomotive repair shops. Most jobs dealing with the repair and maintenance of locomotives and cars of various types required specialized skills and experience. The core of the workforce consisted of machinists, boilermakers, blacksmiths, and other skilled journeymen. Prior to the arrival of the railroad in New Mexico, there was a papacy of skilled native New Mexican tradesmen, until some locals were able to complete the 4-year apprenticeship required by AT&SF for an individual to achieve journeyman status. It was all but impossible for New Mexicans to get technical jobs at the shops. Even for those with appropriate technical skills, ethnic prejudice, which was endemic throughout the railroad industry, was a barrier to hiring and advancement of Hispanos, Native Americans, Asians, and African Americans. Workers in any of those groups found it difficult even to be admitted to the ranks of apprentices. Consequently, newcomers to New Mexico were the earliest hires at the Albuquerque shops, people from the East and recent immigrants from Europe, both places where steam power had been in use for decades. Some arrived on the very first trains to reach Albuquerque, some even earlier than that. It would be years before locals could break into the ranks of shopmen in significant numbers. Native-born Hispanos made up 60% of the labor pool in Albuquerque in 1880, primarily as unskilled laborers. Meanwhile, nearly 3/4 of non-Hispanic whites practiced a technical skill or were proprietors, managers, or professionals. By 1896, there were no Hispanic journeyman machinists working at the shops. Even at lower skill levels, Hispanic surnamed employees remained rare, except as laborers. A similar situation existed for other skilled positions. That would change over the years, but for more than 2 generations, Hispanos were woefully underrepresented within the workforce at the locomotive repair shops, which was the only large employer, that is, with more than 500 employees, in New Mexico territory. The company discriminated even more severely and for longer against African Americans. Their employment opportunities at the shops were limited to jobs such as coal shoveler, flagman, janitor, and messenger. Both Blacks and Hispanos were considered for only a handful of jobs out of a list of 61 that we compiled. As time went on, the payroll at the shops kept growing, and expansion at the shops drove a similar increase in Albuquerque's population. The 1920 census reported that Albuquerque was then home to 15,157 people, up 66.3% since 1910, and up an astounding 143% since 1900. A nationwide shopmen's strike in 1922 provided an opening for more Hispanos to work at the Albuquerque shops. AT&SF's longtime bias against Hispanos was easily overcome by the company's hatred of employees who were union members. When union workers went out on strike, they were often replaced by Hispanos who had already been working at the shops in lower job classifications. Many of them, though, already knew how to skillfully do the various jobs. They just didn't have the job titles. Once that trend started, it accelerated. From 1919 to 1925, the Hispanic share of the shop's workforce increased significantly from before the strike to after the strike, ranging from 10.4% for Boilermaker helpers to a whopping 71.2% for machinist apprentices. It's clear that the strike utterly transformed the ethnic makeup of the roster of workers at the shops. It resulted in a younger, more Hispanic workforce, although foremen and managers remain uniformly non-Hispanic.
The end of steam. The shops and Albuquerque, in general, enjoyed rapid expansion during the 1920s as railroad transportation seemed to be universal. Trains were everywhere. Virtually every town wanted a station, work in shops was humming, and the workforce swelled. In the Morelos neighborhood, between 1900 and 1920, the number of houses jumped 330% to 615, and the various Highlands additions increased by 1,000 houses. Between 1900 and 1940, in excess of 300 new subdivisions were laid out in Albuquerque. Trains ran reliably around the clock, coast to coast, and within every region. It was a period of extreme national optimism, but the economy was also heading toward the worst financial collapse in the country's history. The stock market experienced a catastrophic slide in October 1929. Nationwide deflation set in during 1931, dragging down national economic activity, including in the railroad industry. Fewer locomotive repairs and overhauls were necessary. In response, the Santa Fe reduced its workforce dramatically. But an employment catastrophe was postponed, first by continuing depression and then by World War II. By 1940, war in Europe and Asia was already driving a rapid rise in the volume of U.S. railroad traffic. Recruitment of more shopmen in Albuquerque, especially any with previous experience or training, became pressing priority. The workforce at the Albuquerque shops reached 1,787, a more than fourfold increase since 10 years earlier. At $3.5 million a year, the Santa Fe was meeting the largest non-governmental payroll in the community. Even in the immediate aftermath of the war, there was no let-up in the need to ship supplies and transport people by rail. Now to deal with rebuilding a war-ravaged world and to satisfy long pent-up domestic demands for family housing and retail space. Once again, the locomotive repair shops offered employment to many Albuquerqueans. But the years of the Second World War had made it clear that diesels had prevailed over steam in every measure of efficiency. In an effort both to increase the speed of railroad travel and to lower its personnel expenses, AT&SF began using a new diesel-electric locomotive, which ran many times longer than steam engines between shop visits for maintenance and repair. The first diesel locomotive on the Santa Fe line began service in 1935. This development helped AT&SF weather the prolonged economic crisis, but its effects were ominous for shopmen at Albuquerque and other major steam locomotive repair shops. With the end of the war, the AT&SF committed itself to a system-wide conversion to diesel power. Over the next decade, the Santa Fe rapidly made the switch, adding nearly 200 diesel locomotives to its fleet per year for several years. In August 1957, after 88 eventful years as a company, all steam operations ended on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. The combination of lengthened intervals between overhauls for diesels and the large-scale standardization of diesel replacement parts meant that railroads needed fewer skilled machinists and other shopmen. It was no longer necessary for machinists to fabricate replacement parts from scratch. The know-how and mastery needed to rebuild a powerful steam locomotive from the ground up was now largely superfluous. A whole suite of professions simply disappeared from the employment repertoire. Neighborhoods like Bareilles and South Broadway slipped toward decline. Today, the city of Albuquerque is pursuing steps to ready the shop complex for preservation and redevelopment. We hope you will enjoy reading about a host of other topics dealing with the locomotive repair shops in Overhaul, which can be purchased at many area bookstores, including Bookworks, Barnes & Noble, and at the Wheels Museum at the rail yards, and from Amazon. It can also be ordered directly from the University of New Mexico's distributor, Longleaf, at the web address shown here. Thank you all for watching. Good reading.